good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this breakout session, which is Understanding Gastrointestinal Tract Involvement, and it will be presented by Dr. Elizabeth Volkmann, who is joining us all the way from LA. Dr. Volkmann cares for patients with systemic sclerosis and is an active clinical and translational researcher in both systemic sclerosis and interstitial lung disease. Her research focuses on developing personalised treatment approaches for patients through the discovery of novel biomarkers. And she pioneered the first study to investigate the gut microbiome in patients with systemic sclerosis, and now leads an international consortium of investigators dedicated to understanding how the gut microbiome contributes to inflammation and clinical symptoms in patients with systemic sclerosis. She also participates in clinical trials to help identify new therapies for patients with systemic sclerosis. So I'm surprised you've actually had time for this today, Dr. Volkmann, but I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm just so honored to be here today. It's wonderful that we can connect through Zoom and I can be all the way in Los Angeles and feel like I'm in the same room with all of you. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started with the presentation. But as she mentioned, I am a rheumatologist and I care for patients who have systemic sclerosis. And early on in my training, I became very interested in understanding the GI disease of scleroderma because it's such a difficult problem that patients face. And I really enjoy studying nutrition too. So I encourage you to think of questions as we go through this talk because I have planned ample time to be able to answer any questions you may have. So we'll get started. So the outline for today is we're going to first review how scleroderma affects the gastrointestinal or GI tract. We'll discuss some nutritional strategies that can be helpful in patients with scleroderma. And then finally, we'll discuss some ways you can potentially modify your diet to help alleviate some of the GI symptoms you may experience. So, most patients with systemic sclerosis, in fact, over 90% of them over the course of their disease will have some involvement of their GI tract. And most patients will have involvement of their esophagus, so about 70 to 90% of patients. But a fair number of patients can have involvement of their stomach, and then up to half of all patients can have involvement of their large or small intestine. And then you can see that even 50 to 70% of patients can have involvement of their rectum. So actually outside of the skin, the GI organ system is the second most common organ system affected in patients with systemic sclerosis. And so what happens when patients get these symptoms? So if the esophagus is involved, patients can have issues such as difficulty swallowing, which we call dysphagia. They can have issues with acid reflux or heartburn. When the stomach is involved, patients can have early satiety or the feeling of getting full very easily after eating, bloating, and there can even be some issues with the blood vessels in the stomach where patients can have bleeding. When the small intestine is involved, patients can have problems with malabsorption, so not getting all the vitamin, nutrients, and calories they need from food. And this can result in vitamin deficiencies as well as weight loss. And then when the colon is involved, patients can have issues with the motility of the colon, and this can cause obstruction or pseudo-obstruction is what we call it because it's not a true obstruction, but it can feel that way. And then a lot of patients have constipation, and some patients can have diarrhea, and other patients can have kind of a combination of both. And then I would say another troubling symptom that patients can experience, and this usually happens later in the course of scleroderma, is fecal incontinence as well as rectal prolapse. So as you can imagine, and as you may have already experienced firsthand, GI symptoms in scleroderma can be extremely disruptive. They can compromise your lifestyle, your emotional well-being, as well as your quality of life. And studies have even shown that it's related to symptoms of depression. So this is a major problem. And I think that, as a researcher in this area, we still have a long way to go in trying to understand what causes all of these symptoms. So we think that in general, the GI tract doesn't move as well, and this could happen for a variety of issues. One possibility is that there's collagen deposition. So the excess collagen that you may appreciate in your skin or other organ systems can actually occur in the GI tract. And this causes the muscle to break down. And so without a really strong muscle in the gut, things don't move as well. But beyond that, there's changes that happen in the blood vessels. So you can think of it almost like Raynaud phenomenon, those changes you get in your hands, that can actually happen in the gut so that there's not enough blood flow to key parts of the gut for digestion. And then there's even been demonstrated to be problems with the autonomic nervous system. And this is the nervous system that controls digestion and how the GI tract moves. But there's also evidence that alterations in gut bacteria can cause issues with scleroderma. And what we and others have demonstrated is that patients with scleroderma can sometimes have an increased abundance of what we call pathobiont bacteria, or kind of bad bacteria that promote inflammation, and lower abundance of these healthy commensal bacteria. And this could potentially cause some issues too. And studies have demonstrated when that balance is off, so when you have more of these bad bacteria and less of these healthy bacteria, we think that this creates an environment to promote inflammation, not just in the gut, but actually throughout the body. And this has been demonstrated not only in scleroderma, but also in other autoimmune diseases like inflammatory bowel disease, as well as metabolic diseases such as obesity and diabetes. And so we did a study, as Gemma mentioned, back in 2016, where we were really interested to understand, okay, well, what are the bacteria like in patients with scleroderma? So we had our patients at UCLA undergo a colonoscopy. And during the colonoscopy, we sampled bacteria from two different areas, the cecum, which is the beginning part of the colon, and the sigmoid area. And then we compared that to patients who did not have scleroderma. And what we found were that not only did the patients with scleroderma have an increased abundance of these so-called bad bacteria, but we also found that certain bacteria were associated with symptoms. So patients who had actually higher levels of Bacteroides fragilis, Clostridium, Lactobacillus, these ones listed here, actually had less symptoms. Whereas patients who had these more bad bacteria, Fusobacterium, Actinobacillus, Ruminococcus, they actually had more symptoms. So this really provided the initial evidence to move forward and study this further. And as Gemma mentioned, we're now doing a study looking at scleroderma patients from around the world, because we also realize that diet can have a big impact on the gut microbiome, which I'll show you soon. So let's jump into some nutritional strategies, because I think this is an area that oftentimes when you see your scleroderma specialist, there's so much to cover. There's so much discussion that has to happen about medications and labs and test results that sometimes I find that this gets missed. So I think the first principle that I would like to instill in everyone here today, and this is something that that maybe can be difficult to digest, no pun intended, initially, is that there's really no one single diet that works for every patient with systemic sclerosis. And some of you may have experienced, when you were first diagnosed with this illness, you may have had a friend or a relative that told you, you need to be gluten-free or stop eating dairy, or gave you a book about how to cure your autoimmune disease with diet. But what I can tell you from treating many, many patients with this condition is that there really is no one diet that works for everyone. And the reason being is that, we're all so unique. So just because you have scleroderma, your genetics might be different than another patient with scleroderma. In addition, there are cultural factors that affect diet. And then finally, even where you live in the world and what season you're in. So, if you're in an area where it's very cold, you're going to be trying to eat different foods than in an area where it's very warm, because ultimately you can use your diet to help balance out your immune system. So again, keep in mind that there's no one diet that works for every patient with scleroderma. And in addition to these factors I mentioned, the cultural differences, the genetics, even within the disease, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So some patients with scleroderma, for example, can have lung involvement, others cannot. Some patients may be on immunosuppressive medications or medications that cause GI symptoms, whereas others may not. We're also always exposed to unique life stressors. And, as most people know, when you're exposed to stress, there's a big brain-gut connection. And so this can affect your digestion too. We also all have unique access to certain foods. So, I live in California where we have tons of different fruits and vegetables, but other parts of the United States, people may not have access to all these fruits and vegetables. And also, we're also under the care of different providers, and that makes a difference too. So I find that one of the best ways to kind of approach nutrition when you have scleroderma is to first and foremost develop a relationship with your body and really tune in to how you feel after you eat, because this will be your best guide. It's actually a better guide than any doctor or nutritionist or anything like that, because your body will speak to you in the language of sensation and kind of tell you what foods agree with you and what foods don't. And I think when you begin this process, it can sometimes be overwhelming to try to figure out, okay, which food is causing the issues. And so I find it really helpful to work with patients on keeping a food diary. And this can seem rather tedious at the beginning. You really have to write down everything you eat over the course of the day. Even if you have sugar-free candy, everything you consume, even liquids, should be in this diary. And then you also want to have, maybe columns about how you feel, but not just how you feel, like how do you function that day? What is your energy level? Did you sleep well that night? How was your mood? Because all of these things, again, can be clues into how a food makes you feel. And I find that it's helpful to do this over the course of 2 to 4 weeks, because over that time period, you may just see that there are patterns like, okay, what I've realized is every time I do eat dairy, I get more bloated and I feel more sluggish, or, it may be a different trigger. But try to look for patterns. And as you go through this process, this actually strengthens the relationship you have with yourself, and you begin to understand, again, what foods might be problematic for you and what foods maybe nourish you. But sometimes you can, get to a point where you're like, well, I don't know, maybe it's the dairy, but it could also be when I have gluten. I'm not really sure. And it's hard to decide which one it is. And at this point, it might be helpful to try what's called an elimination diet. And I would recommend doing this with the guidance of your healthcare provider or nutritionist, because when you do an elimination diet, you obviously eliminate certain foods, but you want to make sure you do this safely and you're still getting an adequate number of calories in per day, as well as all the vitamins and nutrients that you need. So these are some of the common triggers that I see in patients who have scleroderma. Again, not all of these are triggers for every patient, but some of these can be. So if you think, okay, dairy and gluten might be problematic for me, what you do in elimination diet is you stop eating those foods, and you want to stop for about 2 to 3 weeks. And then what you're going to do is mindfully reintroduce the food. So you just reintroduce one thing at a time. And so let's say you decide it's the dairy that you're going to reintroduce. You will then, increase, go back to your food diary, and you keep track of your symptoms. And not only what your symptoms are, but what the dairy source is. So for example, sometimes people can tolerate yogurt, but they may not be able to tolerate milk, or they may be able to tolerate butter, but nothing else. So keep track of the source. But I think if you do this very mindfully, this can be really illuminating in terms of what are the foods that cause you distress. The other thing I think that's important to cover in this topic are FODMAPs, and many of you may have heard of this. So FODMAPs are short chain carbohydrates, and they basically move through your intestines undigested. So a lot of patients with scleroderma, when they start to have GI symptoms, get put on what's called a low FODMAP diet. And what I find is that patients who see doctors are given this huge list of things they can't eat. And it can be very overwhelming for patients because sometimes there are foods on there that are their favorite food. And they're like, how can I go without eating peaches? You know, I love peaches. And I think that I would use this more as a guide because not all FODMAP foods are bad. And sometimes it depends on how you prepare them. So here's just some examples of foods that have a higher abundance of FODMAPs that can be problematic for certain patients. So obviously some of these things here, like the sugar-free candies, you can probably let go of because they don't have a lot of nutritional value. But something like broccoli might be good to try back into your diet and see if you can tolerate small amounts. You may not be able to tolerate raw broccoli, but if you cook it in a soup or puree it, small amounts might be good for you. And keep in mind, broccoli has a high abundance of calcium in it and other good minerals. Same with like avocado. Sometimes people can't tolerate raw avocado, but they can grill it or have it cooked and it becomes more tolerable. So again, if you get put on a low FODMAP diet, just keep in mind that you don't want to be missing out on too many fruits and vegetables because you actually need some of these to get all the vitamins that your body needs and your immune system needs. So I would use this list as a guide, and maybe these are the things that you consider when you're doing your elimination diet, but don't just stay on the low FODMAP diet forever because that can lead to some vitamin deficiencies. And then the other thing I think that people don't consider when they're thinking about these FODMAPs is not only how you cook them, but it's also how you combine them with other foods. So for example, if you have a very heavy meal, like if you have pasta with a meat sauce, your digestive tract has to slow down to be able to digest these foods. It takes more energy. And then if, right after you have this, you have a bowl of berries, what can happen often is a lot of bloating and abdominal pain. And the reason being is that the berries, they are supposed to be digested relatively quickly in your GI tract. They should move fast. And if you combine it with foods that take longer to digest, what will happen are the berries in your GI tract can start to ferment, and this can produce more gas. So I would always recommend that if you're going to have any kind of raw fruit, especially like berries, you want to have it on its own. So have it as a snack. Don't have it in combination with another meal where you're having a lot of fat and protein, which again, the GI tract has to work harder to digest. And then other things that can be helpful if you're trying to really improve this balance of bacteria in your gut, you want to try to avoid foods that are processed. And I think that in the United States, we have a lot of these foods. Hopefully you have less there in the UK. But processed foods are things where they add additives and preservatives to foods, and this can change the color of the food, the taste, how long it lasts. So examples would be things like hot dog or bacon, potato chips, a lot of frozen meals. And so if you're wondering, is this food a highly processed food? One of the best things to do is just look at the ingredient list. So if you go into your pantry and you pull a box out or a bag and there's more than 5 ingredients, it's likely that that food has been processed. Especially if you're reading the ingredient list and some of the things on there, you can't even pronounce the names because they're chemicals, that's a high, you should have high suspicion that that's a processed food. And also added sugars can be difficult too. If you have too much added sugars, this can also disrupt the bacterial balance. So there's been some, really interesting studies looking at sort of the dangers of food additives and how they affect the gut bacteria. And so on the left column there, you can see examples of food additives. So some of these you may have heard of, like aspartame or saccharin. Other ones, GML, CMC, I don't even know what this stands for, but these are found commonly in processed foods. And you can see in these studies that they have a significant effect on the gut microbiota, so the bacterial balance. And then this can cause differences in host physiology. So what this means is they looked in these studies and they found more intestinal inflammation, or more inflammation outside of the intestines in places like the liver, even things like glucose intolerance. So I think that if you are going to make one change to your diet to try to help improve this bacterial balance, trying to cut out the processed foods could have a big impact and improve how you feel. And then the other thing that can be helpful is to try to increase your consumption of more natural probiotics. So this is basically foods that have a high abundance of these kind of healthy bacteria that we talked about. So this could be, dairy products, yogurt, milk, if you can tolerate dairy. But there's also, cultured yogurts that are made from non-animal sources. So like coconut milk yogurt, oat milk yogurt, soy milk yogurt. So even if you don't eat dairy, there's other ways to get this in. And then fermented foods. So if you like sauerkraut or pickled vegetables, again, this will have a higher abundance of this healthy bacteria. And this is probably better than taking a probiotic supplement because you're getting, things more naturally. Prebiotics are another way to help improve this balance. And what prebiotics are again, undigested fibers, but these are what the bacteria kind of feed off of and can help promote the growth of these healthy bacteria. So here are examples of some foods that have a high abundance of prebiotics. And keep in mind, you may not be able to tolerate eating all of these foods, but you may in small amounts, or it may depend on how you cook it. If you have, asparagus soup or pureed asparagus, this might be easier to digest than raw asparagus, and you'll be getting a lot of other vitamins and minerals too. And now we'll go through some suggestions for specific GI symptoms. And obviously, there's a lot of different GI symptoms that can occur in scleroderma, but I've decided to focus on, the ones that I think affect the majority of patients with this condition. So I think acid reflux is a big one, and this often occurs early in the course of scleroderma and it can get worse over time. So there are obviously foods that can trigger acid reflux and should be avoided or minimized. And many of you may be already familiar with this list. So fried foods can be difficult, poor quality vegetable oils, red meat, coffee, any kind of hot spices. This promotes kind of more heat. Alcohol, citrus fruits and tomatoes can be difficult, and vinegar. But I think what people don't often keep in mind is that there are actually foods that you can increase your consumption of that can help with the reflux symptoms. So soups can be really good. Like oatmeals or gluten-free oats, yogurts can be good. And we talked about even if you have a sensitivity to cow's milk, you can have non-dairy yogurt. Avocado, spinach can be good. And again, these can be cooked if you can't tolerate them raw. Same with cucumber, liquid chlorophyll can be helpful. And then in terms of a tea, if you like to drink tea, chamomile tea can be very good if you have reflux symptoms. So again, not everything you have to do when you're trying to manage your GI symptoms with your diet. I don't want you to only think about what you have to deprive yourself of, but there's also things that you can do that can help nourish you and alleviate your symptoms without feeling like, oh my gosh, I really can't eat anything. In terms of the bloating, again, this can be a big problem in scleroderma, especially later in the course of the disease. And so a few things that can be helpful for a lot of patients. So one is try to make sure you're drinking enough water during the day, because if the colon does not have enough blood flow and gets dehydrated, it's not going to be able to move as well. So keeping hydration good, especially on hot days, is really important. And then, one thing to keep in mind are white foods. So things like white bread, white rice, white sugar. These are not your friends if you have bloating. So just keep that in mind. Just think of the color white. And these are the foods, even white potatoes. You want to avoid these when you feel bloated. And then these harmful food combinations are also good to keep in mind. So if you're going to have a meal with a lot of fat or protein, don't combine it with a simple carbohydrate like fruit, because you can end up with more bloating. Always have your fruit separately. And then the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is fiber intake. So for people who don't have scleroderma, one of the most common causes of having constipation and bloating is not getting enough fiber in the diet. So if you Google constipation, one of the first things it will say is, take this fiber supplement. And this may work for someone who doesn't have scleroderma. But when you have scleroderma, the issue is not usually you're not getting enough fiber in your diet. There's other issues with the motility of the GI tract. And so if you take too much supplemental fiber, sometimes this can actually make the bloating worse. And so I would be, really cautious with using fiber supplements, especially ones that have additives. And I would try to do it more naturally. So something like ground flaxseed can have a nice amount of fiber in it, and you can sort of titrate over the course of a day how much you're taking in. So, when you have your, let's say, oats in the morning, you could first start by just sprinkling on a little bit of ground flaxseed and seeing how you do. Does it make you feel more bloated? And then over time, you may be able to add a little bit more. But I think this is a far more gentle approach than just taking, Metamucil, which is just like a over-the-counter fiber supplement. It's better to get it through your food naturally. Start out slow, and you can gradually increase over time. Because again, the issue for scleroderma is usually not you're not eating enough fiber. There's other issues going on. Other things that can be helpful, if you have a day where you're, significantly bloated and you're trying to eat, your midday meal, but you're super distended, it might not be a good idea to have a big meal, but maybe to have a more liquid meal. So something like a vegetable soup, pureed vegetables, a smoothie if you can tolerate smoothies. And this kind of can give the gut a little bit of a break. You're still getting the calories that you need to have enough energy through the day. You're getting in, if you're doing vegetables, you're getting in the vitamins and minerals you need, but you're not putting a big strain on the GI tract. So if you are continuously troubled by bloating, you can consider making one of your meals a liquid meal. And you can do it, depending on what works for you. I have some patients that when they wake up in the morning, they can't even imagine eating. They just feel bloated, and they may have, start their day with a smoothie. I have other patients that by the end of the day, they start to feel more bloated. And so then when they go to sleep at night and they lay down, it's very uncomfortable. For those patients, their evening meal may be more of a soup or pureed vegetables. So again, tuning into how you feel and when you have these bloating symptoms can help determine, how you use this nutritional advice to help you. And I think one thing, to keep in mind too is that you want to be warm when you eat. We talked about at the beginning of this talk that that same kind of Raynaud's that can happen in your hands, that process can also happen in the gut too, where you might not be getting enough blood flow. So you want to make sure that you're eating in an environment where you feel warm, because that's going to allow the blood to flow to the gut and help with the digestion process. So don't ever eat if you feel cold. Some herbal teas that can be helpful. So ginger tea is nice to have before meals because it kind of warms up the GI tract and gets it ready for digestion. Chamomile is nice for after meals. And again, this can help with reflux too. Lemon balm is also kind of a nice neutral tea that usually doesn't cause symptoms in many patients, and this you can take between meals. Aloe vera juice can be helpful in the morning for bloating, and this can sometimes promote a bowel movement. But with any herbs, if you're going to start something, I would always talk to your doctor first just to make sure it's safe for you and it's safe to do in combination with the other medications that you're taking. When you have diarrhea, some of the recommendations are similar, but you really want to avoid raw food when you have diarrhea, because raw food has more bacteria on it. The cooking process kills a lot of bacteria. So if you're already having diarrhea, if you introduce more bacteria into the gut with the food, you can actually exacerbate the diarrhea. So make sure if you're having a lot of diarrhea, you want to be having more cooked foods. Making sure you stay hydrated and adding electrolytes to your water can be helpful. Avoid greasy foods, and really you want to be trying to have these kind of soft foods that are easy to digest. So the well-cooked oats, pureed winter squash, things that your GI tract doesn't have to work too hard on to digest. So as I said, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions today, but to summarize, how you eat can have a tremendous effect on how you feel when you have scleroderma. And what I have found in treating many patients with scleroderma is that an individualized approach works best, because there's really no one diet that works for everyone. And the best thing that you can do as a person is develop a relationship with your body and tune in to how you feel after you eat certain foods and let that be your guide. You want to make sure that you're always eating when you feel relaxed and when you feel warm. You want to avoid the processed foods, added sugars. If you have a lot of bloating, diarrhea, raw foods are going to be difficult for you. And really, a lot of my patients transition over time to a plant-based diet, and I think that this is can be a very healthy diet for patients with scleroderma. Again, it's not for everyone, but for many patients, they feel better when they do a plant-based diet. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and time today, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you have.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Volkmann. That was really, really interesting. Thank you. And we've had loads of questions. Okay. I don't think we'll get through them all, but let's try. Claire asks, with a food diary, do potential after effects of food tend to be within hours, or can symptoms slow burn or emerge a day later?
That's a fantastic question. I'm so glad that you brought that up. But the timing of when the symptoms occur can be different for different patients. So I have some patients where they immediately know if there's onion in something because they feel it right away. But then there are other patients that they may not feel it till the next day. So I think the food diary can be very helpful because you start to see these patterns, and you may say, okay, last night I ate pasta for dinner. I felt okay afterwards, but then the next day I felt very sluggish or tired, or I felt more bloated or constipated. So the timing can be different for everyone. So I think when you do your diary, keep that in mind, that you may not be looking at the symptoms on that day, but you may be looking the next day too.
Thanks so much. Liz had asked about what the research says about the impact on scleroderma of following a strict vegan diet. She has been a vegan for many years and honestly feels it protects her from the worst of the disease.
That's great. I'm a vegan too. We haven't, we're starting now to look at this when we're looking at our study, looking at the gut bacteria of patients with scleroderma. And I've started to collect an extensive amount of nutritional information on what the patients are consuming. And so I think in our future studies, we'll be able to determine whether a vegan diet or some kind of version of a plant-based diet can lead to improvements. But I think that, like I said at the end of the talk, if you're going to make one change to your diet, considering to do more plant-based or at least less meat might be helpful for you. Because I didn't show it here, but there's a lot of studies looking at meat consumption and how that can affect the balance of gut bacteria. And what's really interesting is that they've done studies where they've had patients randomized, like a clinical trial, where some people do a plant-based diet and others do a higher meat-based diet. And within a few days of going on a new diet, there are already changes in the gut microbiome. So I think that it's really one way that patients can kind of change the course of their disease by I think, hold on. I think you're muted, Gemma. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, there was a slight technical issue there. It wouldn't let me unmute. Great, thank you. And actually, James has a question that leads on to what you were saying. So he says he had bad cramps and acid and spasms and has significantly given up meat and fish. However, he has chronic anemia and wonders if you could suggest good alternatives to eat for B vitamins, because he's saying that wheatgrass it's not possible to drink so much wheatgrass.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you think about the vegetables that are higher in the B vitamins, a good way to remember them is that anything that's very dark green usually has a good amount of B vitamins. So, spinach will have a lot, Swiss chard, kale, and you may not be able to tolerate having these raw, but if you cook them, again, blend them in a smoothie, sometimes they're easier to digest. But, sometimes people still, despite trying their best with eating food, can't get enough of the vitamin in, or the body doesn't absorb it in the way that it should. And in that case, you may consider taking a supplement. But I would always do this with your doctor, because there can be dangers of taking too much of a supplement. And so I would always make sure that a doctor or someone is checking your vitamin B levels and then seeing what the supplement does by rechecking them.
Yeah. Thank you. And Lynn's question is quite short, actually. She would like to know your thoughts on digestive enzymes to aid the gut.
Yeah, that's great. I think digestive enzymes, the concept makes sense to me, right? Because you want to do everything possible to help your body digest food. But the problem is that a lot of the digestive enzymes that are available over the counter, like if you go in your natural food store, they're not regulated. So we actually don't know. The stomach might just digest them and they don't really get down to the small intestine where they're needed and where the pancreas actually secretes the enzymes. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence that the ones that are over the counter are very helpful. But there are certain foods that you can eat that naturally have like enzymes in them. So something like papaya, I don't know if you can get this where you are, but this has something in it called papain, and papain is a natural digestive enzyme. So you can kind of research what foods have natural digestive enzymes, and that will probably be better for you than taking an enzyme supplement, because again, the ones that are over the counter are really probably not very effective.
Great, thank you. And actually, Ellen and Suzanne sort of asked two similar questions. So Ellen would like to know about a way to make it safe to eat spicy foods. And Suzanne is related because she says she has a severe intolerance to onion and onion powder. And it really limits what she can eat, especially when eating out. She's also lactose intolerant, so the combination is difficult. So any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the spicy foods, it really depends on what is the spice that's making it spicy. So there are some things like sometimes patients can tolerate a little bit of cayenne pepper, but they may not be able to tolerate black pepper. So it may be that you have to kind of experiment with different spices. And the best way to do this is cooking at home. I think when you go out to a restaurant, there's so many variables, you really don't know exactly probably what they're putting in everything, and there can be cross-contamination even when you say like, I cannot have onions, like they could have been cutting an onion with a knife and then started cutting it here. So I think the best way to explore spices is to really try home cooking and trying one at a time. I'm happy to share too, there's a really lovely book that I'm reading now about spices and it kind of goes through all the spices you can imagine and the effect it can have on your body. And I could share the title with Gemma and she could maybe distribute it to you, but it's a really easy to understand book. But again, I think the best way, and this speaks to the other question about the individual with the onion and lactose intolerance, is like it can be very difficult to go out to eat, and a lot of my patients end up being very selective about where they do eat and only choosing places that are very accommodating. Sometimes it can be difficult, especially if you're going out to eat with friends or people maybe you don't even know that well and you feel uncomfortable about speaking up. But never feel embarrassed, because this is, your health, and if you're paying money to eat food, you should have exactly what you want. And so I think that's important.
Definitely. Thank you. So Janine asks, do you have any information on the lectin-free diet? That's LECTIN, if I've said that.
Yeah. So lectins are in a lot of different foods. They're in things like anything from peas. They can be in like ketchup. But there's been a lot of research on lectins and the gut bacterial balance, and showing that it could maybe promote more inflammation. So I think this is also something that we'll look at in the future in scleroderma. But I find that it can be a little bit complicated for patients to try to, it's already hard to look at that FODMAP list, and then maybe you're gluten-free. So the lectin brings that to a whole nother level, because a lot of foods have lectin in it. So I think it's something to be mindful of. And if, let's say, you want to do an elimination diet, if you look up the foods that are high in lectin, maybe those are the ones you want to try eliminating first to see if you feel better without them. But it's a great, great question.
Right, sorry. So Margaret asks, I've been on a mix of 3 different laxatives for several years for bowel movement. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the laxatives are sometimes needed in patients who have scleroderma, because if you're not having a daily bowel movement, or at least every other day, this can have not only cause bloating, but you can have buildup of toxins and things that you really want to eliminate from your body. So sometimes you have to do the laxatives. I would think about kind of trying to do more natural laxatives, like in addition to the pharmaceutical grade ones. So things like magnesium powder you can add to your water. I have a lot of my patients do that in the evening time, because it can also have a calming effect on them and help them with sleep. This can actually help promote a bowel movement in the morning. Sometimes even, this may sound strange, but a spoonful of olive oil in the evening too, again, kind of can help lubricate the gut. So, exploring some natural things, if you do those, you may be able to lower the amount of, pharmaceutical grade laxative that you need. But I don't think patients should have shame about needing to use a laxative, because again, keep in mind, in scleroderma, the gut really slows down. And so you need to do something to promote that motility. And it's really important to have regular bowel movements just for your overall health.
Great. So we've got around 5 minutes left, so we'll try and rattle through these. So Carly asks, is a colonoscopy or a breath test the way to go to identify if bacteria is causing stomach pain?
That's a great question. So the breath test looks for something called small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And we have found that patients who have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or what we call SIBO, do usually have imbalances in their gut bacteria. So that's one way to do it. The colonoscopy won't really show it unless someone is doing research like we did in sampling the bacteria. But usually the colonoscopy would just be to look at the colon, see if there are polyps and issues like that. So I think the breath test would probably be the easiest way for that.
Lovely. And Michael asks, sometimes I have sudden attacks of shaking and feeling weak and tired. It feels like acute hypoglycemia, but I have eaten enough at that moment. What could it be?
Well, I would mention this to your doctor, because you want to make sure that you do have a good blood sugar. But I think what's important when you have scleroderma is to eat frequent meals throughout the day. A lot of times patients can't tolerate having 3 big meals. They need to have 5 or 6 kind of small meals throughout the day. This actually helps the motility of the GI tract. I kind of think about like if you think about a horse, how the horse has to kind of graze and then it walks and it eats a little bit more. And this is actually really healthy for the horse's digestion. It's kind of similar when you have scleroderma. You want to keep the motility of the GI tract moving, and this will help keep the blood sugar kind of stable too. I think you also want to avoid foods that can cause the blood sugar to go low abruptly. So this would be like if you have a lot of added sugars, it can spike the blood sugar, but then sort of what goes up comes down very quickly too. So having the frequent meals throughout the day and then avoiding the added sugars might help you with this.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And Jackie asks, I eat very little but keep putting on weight. I do lather my salads and veg with olive oil to get the food down. What type of food could we try to speed up metabolism?
That's a good question. And you know, a lot of patients with scleroderma have the opposite problem, but I think it's important to face this issue too. One thing I would look at are the processed foods, because this is one thing that if you eliminate these from your diet, you basically eliminate most unhealthy foods. So I would try that. And then the frequent small meals can be helpful too in sort of speeding up the metabolism. And then another way is exercise. So exercise is a really important part of health in general. But if you start an exercise program, and it doesn't have to be a super intense one, but just some kind of physical activity, this can help boost metabolism as well. Especially some kind of strength training. The more muscle you have, the more your metabolism is active.
Excellent. We've probably got time for one more. So hopefully I won't choose one that's a long answer. So this is for Ninda. I recently had a barium swallow test, and this shows some slight narrowing. Is this quite normal with someone with scleroderma?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. There can be narrowing along different parts of the GI tract, and you know, when it happens, let's say in the esophagus, it can make it difficult to swallow, and you may need to adjust your diet so that you're not eating like, you know, big chunks of meat or big pieces of bread, but you're having more softer foods. But this absolutely can be related to the scleroderma.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of the session, and thank you so much. And actually, I can see from the chat that everyone's really appreciated the answers. There's lots of good feedback, and also that everyone would really love the title of that book. So I will make sure to share it afterwards.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Volkmann.